Every day, we trade the most valuable things we have, our time, our energy, and our labor, in exchange for something that has absolutely no intrinsic value. Look at a paper bill in your wallet, or the glowing digital numbers on your banking app. What are they, really? They are not actual wealth, they are a promise, a collective belief that tomorrow someone else will accept that piece of paper in exchange for real, tangible goods like food, energy, or shelter. But if you look closely at history, a terrifying truth emerges. The track record of governments and central banks keeping that promise is exactly 0%. Throughout human history, there have been thousands of fiat currencies, paper money backed by nothing but the decree of the state, and every single one of them has eventually collapsed. The average lifespan of a fiat currency is just 27 years. In 1729, the French philosopher Voltaire made a brilliant and brutal observation. He said, "Paper money eventually returns to its intrinsic value, zero." When a government or a ruling class gains the power to print money out of thin air without having to dig gold out of the ground or back it with real assets, they never stop. The political temptation is always too great, and the total collapse of that currency ceases to be a mere possibility. It becomes a mathematical certainty. Today, we look at the rising cost of groceries and housing in shock. We complain about inflation as if it were a natural disaster or a modern accident. But inflation is not an accident. It is a feature of the system. It is a 1,000-year-old mechanism of invisible theft. Right now, the United States is sitting on over $38 trillion in national debt. The global economy is built on a fragile mountain of printed paper that can mathematically never be repaid. We are standing at the very edge of a historical cliff. But to understand exactly how this system will end, we first have to understand how it started. In this video, we are going to travel back in time. We will look at the very first paper money experiment in China in 1024. We will witness the devastating Mississippi bubble in France in 1720, the tragic Wheelbarrow Economy of Weimar Germany in 1923, and the fatal Nixon Shock of 1971. We are going to uncover the greatest heist in human history, how the rulers of the world slowly confiscated real gold and handed the people paper illusions instead. Let's open the history books. To find the birthplace of the paper illusion, we have to travel east to the Song Dynasty in 11th century China. At the time, China was an economic powerhouse. Trade was booming, but there was a massive physical problem: the money itself. The Chinese used coins made of copper and iron. Because these metals were not as scarce as gold or silver, their value was low. If a merchant wanted to buy a large shipment of silk or salt, he literally had to transport thousands of pounds of iron coins in a wooden cart. It was exhausting, dangerous, and inefficient. So the free market did what it always does. It innovated. Merchants started leaving their heavy iron coins in secure deposit houses. In exchange, the deposit house gave them a piece of paper, a receipt. This paper was not money, it was a claim on money. A merchant could travel hundreds of miles with a lightweight piece of paper, hand it to another merchant, and that merchant knew he could exchange it for the physical iron or copper at any time. They called it flying cash. It worked perfectly because it was backed one-to-one by physical metal. But the government was watching, and they realized something profound. Whoever controls the receipts controls the wealth. In the year 1024 AD, the Song Dynasty stepped in. They banned private deposit houses and established a strict government monopoly on the issuance of paper notes. They created the jiaozi, the world's first official government-issued paper currency. At first, the government promised that every jiaozi was backed by metal in the state vaults, and for a little while the system functioned. But then, as it always does in the history of empires, war broke out.
The Song Dynasty found itself in a brutal, expensive conflict with northern invaders. War requires massive amounts of resources, weapons, and most importantly, soldiers who demand to be paid. But the government's vaults were running low on metal. Faced with the choice of either raising taxes on angry citizens or admitting defeat, the emperor discovered the fatal magic of the printing press. They simply printed more jiaozi. They printed paper that had no iron, copper, or gold backing it up. It was just paper, enforced by the violence of the state. Suddenly, there was an explosion of currency flooding the market, chasing the exact same amount of goods. The merchants weren't stupid. They realized the paper was being diluted, so they demanded more paper for their goods. Prices skyrocketed. The purchasing power of the jiaozi plummeted. Within a few decades, China experienced the first recorded hyperinflation in human history. The currency collapsed, becoming completely worthless. But the addiction to printing money is hard to break. When the Mongols, led by Kublai Khan, conquered China in the 13th century, they didn't fix the system, they doubled down on it. Kublai Khan issued his own fiat currency, called the Chow. When the famous Italian explorer Marco Polo visited China, he was mesmerized by this system. He wrote in his journals that the great Khan had discovered the secret of alchemy, not turning lead into gold, but turning the bark of mulberry trees into money. To ensure people used his paper money, Kublai Khan passed a simple law. Anyone who refused to accept the chow or tried to hoard real gold and silver would be executed. But even the threat of death cannot suspend the laws of mathematics. To fund his lavish empire and his failed invasions of Japan, Kublai Khan printed the chow into oblivion. Despite the death penalty, the people lost all faith in the paper. The Mongol economy spiraled into chaos, wiping out the wealth of the population and ultimately contributing to the collapse of the Yuan dynasty. The very first experiment with paper money ended in total disaster. The lesson from 1024 was crystal clear. When a government has the power to create money out of thin air, they will always, eventually, abuse it. The temptation to print is simply too great. But the world didn't learn the lesson. 500 years later, the disease of paper money would infect Europe, and it would start with a gambler who convinced a bankrupt king to trade his gold for a grand illusion. In 1715, the Sun King of France, King Louis XIV, died. He left behind the magnificent Palace of Versailles, a legacy of absolute power, and a country that was completely and utterly bankrupt. Decades of relentless wars and unimaginable royal extravagance had drained the national treasury. The French government was drowning in a mountain of debt that it could never mathematically repay. Taxes were already so high that the peasants were starving. The Duke of Orleans, who took over as regent for the child king, was desperate. Enter a man named John Law. John Law was not a nobleman or a traditional banker. He was a Scottish fugitive, a convicted murderer who had escaped a London prison, a mathematical genius, and a professional gambler. And he arrived in Paris with a pitch that sounded like pure magic. Law told the regent that the problem with the French economy was gold and silver. Precious metals were too scarce. They had to be dug out of the ground, which slowed down trade and restricted economic growth. His solution? The government should confiscate the gold, lock it in a vault, and issue paper money instead. The paper would be easier to carry, easier to trade, and most importantly for the regent, easier to create. Desperate for a way out of debt, the regent agreed. In 1716, John Law established the Banque Générale, which soon became the Royal Bank. It was the blueprint for the modern central bank. At first, it was a massive success. Law issued paper notes that were backed by real gold and silver. Because the paper was so convenient, trade in France skyrocketed. The economy recovered. John Law was hailed as a genius. But then, the gambler in John Law took over. He didn't just want to control the money supply, he wanted to control the entire economy. Law created a massive corporation called the Mississippi Company. He convinced the French government to give this company a total monopoly on trade in the French territory of Louisiana in North America. He marketed Louisiana to the public France as a paradise overflowing with mountains of gold, silver, and exotic spices. In reality, it was mostly a disease-ridden swamp. But in 1719, there was no internet. No one could verify the claims. They only had the marketing. To get the public to buy shares in the Mississippi Company, Law used a devastating financial weapon, his printing press. He started printing massive amounts of unbacked paper money through his royal bank and used it to pump up the price of the Mississippi Company stock. He also loaned this newly printed paper to citizens so they could buy the stock themselves. The result was the greatest financial mania Europe had ever seen. The share price of the Mississippi Company exploded from 500 livres to 10,000 livres in just a few months. Everyone in France, from the poorest chambermaids to the highest-ranking aristocrats, was borrowing paper money to buy paper shares. People became so incomprehensibly rich, so incredibly fast, that the French language had to invent a brand new word just to describe them. That word was millionaire. But just like the Chinese jiaozi, John Law's system had a fatal mathematical flaw. He had doubled the entire money supply of France in less than a year. Because there was suddenly twice as much paper money chasing the exact same amount of goods, the cost of living in Paris skyrocketed. The price of food doubled. The price of clothing tripled. Inflation was destroying the working class, even as the stock market soared. Then the smart money woke up. A few wealthy aristocrats, most notably the Prince de Conti, realized that the Louisiana gold was a myth. They quietly sold their shares at the top of the market, took their mountains of paper money, and went to the royal bank to exchange it for physical gold. The prince literally brought 3 wagons to cart away his gold. When the public saw this, panic set in. Everyone rushed to the bank to cash in their paper notes. But John Law had printed vastly more paper than there was gold in the vaults. The bank was empty. In a desperate attempt to save his system, Law did what tyrannical governments always do when their money fails. He made gold illegal. He banned the export of precious metals and made it a crime for any citizen to hold more than 500 livres in gold or silver. The government sent police to raid people's homes and confiscate their physical wealth, forcing them to accept the dying paper money. It didn't work. By late 2017, the Mississippi bubble burst completely. The shares plummeted 99%. The paper money became entirely worthless. The millionaires became paupers overnight. The streets of Paris descended into riots. John Law, the alchemist of finance, had to flee France in the dead of night, disguised as a beggar, to avoid being torn apart by the mob. The French economy was absolutely devastated, wiping out the savings of an entire generation and planting the seeds of poverty and anger that would eventually explode into the French Revolution. John Law proved that a central bank can create the illusion of wealth by printing paper, but it cannot create actual value. Unfortunately, 200 years later, a modern industrialized nation would try the exact same experiment. Only this time, they wouldn't just destroy their economy, they would destroy their society and pave the way for the darkest chapter in human history.
The tragedy of France was forgotten. 200 years later, humanity repeated the exact same mistake, but this time, the consequences plunged the entire world into darkness. After losing World War I in 1918, Germany was crushed under the Treaty of Versailles. The victorious Allies demanded massive war reparations, but they didn't want German paper. They demanded payment in gold and foreign currency. By 1923, the German gold reserves were completely depleted. When Germany failed to make its payments, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. In protest, the German workers went on a massive strike. The economy was paralyzed, foreign debts were looming, and striking workers needed to be paid.
Faced with this impossible crisis, the Weimar Republic made the most destructive financial decision in modern history. They turned on the printing presses. The government began printing the Papiermark blindly, running the machines 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They thought they could print their way out of a crisis. The result was a hyperinflationary death spiral. Money flooded the streets, but it was backed by absolutely nothing. The inflation became so violent that the value of the currency halved every few hours. A cup of coffee that cost a few marks in the morning would cost millions by the afternoon. Factory workers were paid twice a day. As soon as the midday bell rang, they would sprint to the stores to buy whatever they could before their wages became worthless by sunset. People entering restaurants would negotiate and pay for their meals before sitting down, knowing the price would double by the time they finished eating. This era became known as the Wheelbarrow Economy. People didn't carry money in their wallets. They needed literal wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. Famous photographs from the era show children sitting on the streets building toy houses out of stacks of worthless currency. People used paper money as wallpaper because it was cheaper than actual wallpaper. During the freezing German winter, it was cheaper to burn bundles of cash in the stove than to use that cash to buy firewood. The money had literally returned to its intrinsic value, paper. But the true horror of 1923 wasn't just mathematical, it was the psychological destruction of a nation. The hyperinflation completely wiped out the German middle class. If you were a responsible citizen who had saved 100,000 marks over a lifetime of hard work for your retirement, that life savings was suddenly not even enough to buy a single egg. The government had stolen the life energy of its people. Trust in the institutions, trust in the currency, and trust in society completely evaporated. When a nation loses its savings and its hope, it turns to extremes. When people are hungry and desperate, they will listen to any dangerous leader who promises to fix the broken system. It was directly upon this foundation of total economic devastation and public rage that Adolf Hitler built his rise to power. Weimar Germany proved that when fiat currency dies, it doesn't just break the economy, it breaks society. You might think this is ancient history. You might think modern, sophisticated nations could never fall into this trap. But decades later, the entire planet was forced into the exact same experiment. In the next chapter, we will see how the world was taken off the gold standard, setting the stage for the massive inflation and the $38 trillion debt crisis we are living through right now. Before we look at the final act of this 1,000-year tragedy, please take a second right now to hit the bell icon and turn on all notifications so you don't miss our future videos. For a long time after the horrors of Weimar Germany, the world tried to tie the hands of governments. They knew the printing press was a weapon of mass destruction. As World War II was coming to an end in 1944, leaders from 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire to design a new global financial system. It was called the Bretton Woods Agreement. Because the United States held the vast majority of the world's physical gold at the time, the world agreed to make the US dollar the global reserve currency. But there was a strict rule: the dollar had to be backed by gold. The exchange rate was fixed at $35 for 1 ounce of gold. Every other currency in the world was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. It was a system built on physical reality. If a country held US dollars, they knew they were holding a receipt for physical gold stored securely in American vaults. But just like the Song Dynasty in 1024, and just like John Law in 1720, the temptation to cheat the system was too great. By the 1960s, the United States was facing massive expenses. They were fighting a highly unpopular and incredibly expensive war in Vietnam, while simultaneously trying to fund massive domestic welfare programs known as the Great Society. The government needed money, but raising taxes is politically dangerous. So the United States did what failing empires always do. They secretly turned on the printing press. They started printing and spending far more paper dollars than they actually had gold to back up. But the rest of the world wasn't blind. Other nations, led primarily by French President Charles de Gaulle, realized the math didn't add up. They looked at the massive inflation of the dollar and realized the U.S. was essentially exporting its inflation to the rest of the world. So France did exactly what the smart aristocrats did during the Mississippi bubble. They called the bluff. They sent ships across the Atlantic, handed the paper dollars back to the United States, and demanded their physical gold. Other countries panicked and rushed to do the same. It was a global bank run on the United States Treasury. The gold reserves at Fort Knox were draining at an alarming rate. America was on the verge of defaulting on its promise to the world. Faced with total financial collapse, the United States made a decision that would change human history forever. On the evening of August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon interrupted regular television programming to address the nation. He announced that he was directing the Secretary of the Treasury to temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He blamed international speculators. He promised it was just a temporary measure to protect the dollar. That temporary measure is still in place more than half a century later. In that single moment, known as the Nixon Shock, the last remaining anchor to physical reality was severed. The United States officially defaulted on its gold obligation. The dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed by absolutely nothing except the promise of politicians and the military might of the U.S. government. And because the entire world's financial system was pegged to the dollar, every single currency on Earth simultaneously became fiat. For the first time in 5,000 years of human history, the entire globe was operating on a financial system backed by thin air. The gold standard was dead. The era of unlimited paper had begun. Since 1971, the money printer has never stopped. The result? The cost of living has skyrocketed, wages have stagnated, and the middle class has been hollowed out. Governments have accumulated mountains of debt that can never be mathematically repaid. Which brings us to today and the final stage of this 1,000-year cycle.
Welcome to the final act. We are currently living through the climax of an economic experiment that began 55 years ago when the world severed its final tie to gold. Since 1971, without the physical restraint of precious metals, governments have treated the global economy like a giant casino. The money printer has been running non-stop. We have seen financial crisis after financial crisis, the dot-com bubble, the 2008 housing crash, the 2020 pandemic lockdowns, and every single time, the government's only solution has been the exact same one used by the Song Dynasty in 1024, John Law in 1720, and the Weimar Republic in 1923. Print more paper. Today, we are facing the mathematical consequences of those decisions. The United States national debt has now surpassed a staggering $38 trillion. To put that number into perspective, if you paid back $1 every single second, it would take you over 1 million years to pay off just $1 trillion. At $38 trillion, the debt is mathematically impossible to repay through normal taxation. In fact, the U.S. government is now spending over $1 trillion a year just to pay the interest on the debt they already owe. They are caught in a fatal debt spiral. They have to borrow more money just to pay the interest on the old money they borrowed. The only way out is to inflate the debt away. They have to print trillions of new dollars to make the old debt cheaper to pay off. This brings us to the most important and the most misunderstood concept in this entire video. Inflation is not an accident. Inflation is not caused by greedy grocery stores or supply chain issues. Inflation is a deliberate government policy. It is a hidden tax.
When a central bank prints trillions of dollars out of thin air, they do not create new wealth. They simply dilute the value of the dollars that already exist. They are silently reaching into your bank account, your wallet, and your retirement fund and stealing your purchasing power. You are working harder. Your salary might even be going up, but you are getting poorer because the money you were paid in is becoming worthless. It is the greatest, most sophisticated mechanism of wealth confiscation in human history. But the rulers of the financial system know that the public is waking up. They know the math is breaking. They know the fiat system is reaching its terminal stage. So what is their grand solution to fix the collapsing paper economy? Do they go back to sound money? Do they restrict their spending? No, they double down. They want to completely eliminate paper money and replace it with ultimate, absolute control. Enter the Central Bank Digital Currency, or CBDC. Governments around the world are currently rolling out digital versions of their fiat currencies. On the surface, they will market this as a matter of convenience and security. They will say it's just like using Apple Pay or your banking app. But a CBDC is fundamentally different. It is programmable money. With a CBDC, the central bank doesn't just print the money, they track every single transaction you make. They can program the digital currency to have an expiration date, forcing you to spend it before it vanishes to stimulate the economy. They can restrict what you're allowed to buy based on your carbon footprint or your social credit score. And most terrifyingly, with a single keystroke, they can freeze your wallet entirely. It is the final, perfect evolution of Kublai Khan's paper money monopoly. It is a financial prison built on blockchain technology. We have spent the last 1,000 years moving from hard gold to paper receipts, to unbacked paper fiat, and now to programmable digital surveillance tokens. The cycle of currency failure is almost complete. When a fiat system reaches the end of its lifespan, history shows us that wealth doesn't just disappear, it transfers. It transfers from those holding the paper dying to those holding hard, scarce assets. So how do you survive the end game? How do you escape a system designed to slowly steal your time and energy?
To escape a system rigged to inflate, you must step completely outside of it. For 1,000 years, humanity's only real defense against the printing press was physical gold. But gold has a fatal flaw in the modern digital age. It is heavy, it is hard to transport, and as history showed us in 1720 France and 1971 America, it is incredibly easy for the government to centralize in vaults and eventually confiscate. We needed a new technology. We needed an asset that possessed the absolute, unbreakable scarcity of gold, but could be transmitted across the world at the speed of light. We needed money that didn't require trust in a politician, a desperate king, or a central banker. In 2009, exactly as the global banking system was collapsing under the weight of its own debt, that escape hatch was discovered: Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the only monetary network in human history that cannot be altered by human greed. There is no CEO to print more shares. There is no Federal Reserve chairman to manipulate the interest rates to fund a war. And by the strict laws of its code, there will only ever be 21 million coins. It is a mathematical fortress. While fiat currencies and CBDCs are designed to melt your purchasing power and track your every move, Bitcoin is designed to preserve your human energy and protect your absolute freedom. It is the ultimate rejection of the 1,000-year paper money experiment. We are witnessing the final days of the global fiat empire. The 27-year lifespan of the current system is long overdue, and the $38 trillion death spiral cannot be stopped. The smart money is already moving for the exits. But it's not just everyday citizens who are realizing this. Entire nations are waking up to the math, and a massive global power shift is happening right now behind the scenes. Countries are actively preparing for the collapse of the paper system and abandoning the US dollar at a record pace.
If you want to understand exactly how this global geopolitical shift is playing out and what it means for the future of your wealth, you need to watch this video right now. The Death of the Dollar, Why the World is Dumping the USD. Click the video on your screen or find the link in the pinned comment below. The 1,000-year paper illusion is finally breaking. Make sure you are holding something real when it does. I'll see you in the next video.